Have you ever felt like the world is just too loud, too chaotic to even breathe? What if every sudden noise was a trigger, a reminder of a past you can't escape? And what if, just when you thought you'd built walls high enough to shut it all out, someone came along and asked you to step right back into the fire? There's a story about a man who lived in the quietest corners of his mind, running from anything that could shatter his fragile peace. A man named James Carter, who once stood tall but now flinched at the sound of a car backfiring or a 4th of July firecracker popping in the distance. But something, or someone, was about to pull him out of the shadows he'd hidden in for so long. James Carter lived on the outskirts of a small town in Georgia, where the air always smelled faintly of pine and the roads stretched endlessly under the hot southern sun. His home was a weathered cabin tucked away near the Chattahoochee River, far from the hustle of Atlanta's city lights or the chatter of neighborhood barbecues. It was a place where Spanish moss draped over ancient oaks, and the only sounds were the crickets at night or the occasional splash of a fish breaking the river's glassy surface. James had chosen this spot for a reason. It was quiet, far from the clamor of life, a sanctuary for a man who couldn't stand the suddenness of noise. At 42 years old, James carried himself like someone twice his age, his broad shoulders hunched as if bracing for an invisible blow. His face, weathered by years under the desert sun of far-off battlefields, was marked by deep lines around his hazel eyes that seemed to look past everything and everyone. His hands, rough and calloused, often trembled when he poured his morning coffee from a chipped mug, a lingering ghost of something he wouldn't speak of. He wore faded flannel shirts, the kind you'd find in any Georgia thrift store, and a beat-up Braves cap pulled low over his brow as if to shield himself from more than just the sun. Every morning, he'd sit on his porch with that coffee, staring out at the river, listening to the world in a way most folks couldn't understand, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, a fact few in town knew because he never spoke of it. He didn't join the local VFW, didn't march in the Memorial Day parade down Main Street, didn't even stop by the diner for a slice of pecan pie and small talk like most veterans did. Instead, he kept to himself, a lone figure walking the gravel paths near his cabin, always with his head down, always with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. But if you looked close, you'd see the way his jaw tightened when a truck roared by on the highway, or how he'd freeze mid-step at the distant crack of a hunter's rifle echoing through the woods. It was as if every loud sound was a grenade going off in his mind, pulling him back to a place he'd fought so hard to leave behind. His days were a carefully constructed routine, a fragile attempt at normalcy in a world that felt anything but. He'd wake before dawn, the sky still bruised with the last shades of night, and head out to tend a small vegetable garden he'd started behind the cabin. There, among the rows of tomatoes and collard greens, he'd sink his hands into the red Georgia clay, the earth grounding him in a way nothing else could. He'd spend hours there, crouched low, whispering to himself sometimes, though no one was around to hear. After, he'd drive his old Ford pickup into town once a week for supplies, always at the crack of dawn when the streets of Dahlonega were still empty. He'd nod politely to Miss Clara at the general store, who'd known his mama back in the day, but he'd never linger for her usual, "How you doing, sugar?" He'd grab his canned goods, a few packs of jerky, and head back to his solitude before the world could wake up and overwhelm him. But beneath this quiet life, there was a crack, a fault line running through James's soul that no amount of routine could patch over. At night, when the crickets fell silent and the darkness pressed in, he'd sit in his recliner with a single lamp casting shadows across the room, clutching a worn-out photograph he kept hidden in a tin box under his bed. It was a picture of him and his squad, taken under a blazing sun, their faces smeared with dust, but bright with laughter. He'd trace his thumb over the edges of that photo, his breath hitching as if the weight of those smiles was too much to bear. Some nights, he'd wake up gasping, sheets tangled around him, the echo of an explosion ringing in his ears, even though the cabin was silent. He'd stumble to the bathroom, splash cold water on his face, and stare into the mirror, whispering, "You're home, man. You're home." But the reflection staring back never seemed convinced. The town knew little of James's struggles, though whispers floated around like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. Old-timers at the diner would mutter about that Carter boy who came back different, who didn't laugh no more, didn't join in on fish fries or tailgate parties during football season. They'd shake their heads, sip their sweet tea, and change the subject, because in the South, some pains were too heavy to speak of outright. James felt those unspoken words like a weight on his chest, but he didn't fight them. He didn't have the energy to explain why he couldn't stand the sound of fireworks on Independence Day, why he'd crossed the street to avoid a car with a loud exhaust, why he'd left a life of camaraderie for one of solitude. He just wanted to be left alone, to keep the noise of the world and the noise in his head at bay. Yet, even in a life as carefully guarded as his, the unexpected has a way of sneaking in. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of sticky Georgia morning where the humidity clung to your skin like a second layer, and James was hauling a bag of mulch from his truck to the garden. The river glistened in the distance, a ribbon of silver under the rising sun, and the world felt for a fleeting moment almost peaceful. He just set the bag down, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel path leading to his cabin. His heart stuttered, his muscles tensing as if expecting a threat. He turned slowly, squinting against the glare, and saw a dusty Subaru pulling up, a car that didn't belong to anyone he knew. A woman stepped out, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, wearing a simple sundress and sandals that looked out of place on the rough terrain. She carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, and her face held a kind of quiet determination that made James's stomach twist with unease. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with his hands clenched at his sides as she approached, her steps measured but unafraid. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice carrying a soft southern drawl, the kind you'd hear in church on Sundays. He gave a curt nod, his throat tight, wishing she'd just turn around and leave him to his silence. "I'm Emily Harper," she said, stopping a few feet away, her hazel eyes searching his face. "I teach history at Lumpkin County High just down the road. I've heard about you from some folks in town, and I wanted to ask for your help." Her words hung in the air, heavy with something James couldn't quite name. He shifted his weight, the mulch bag forgotten at his feet, his mind racing with reasons to say no before she could even explain. But then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out like an offering. "I'm teaching a unit on modern wars, and my students, they need to hear from someone who's been there, someone who knows what it really means. I think you could change how they see the world, Mr. Carter." James stared at the paper, his chest tightening as if the air had been sucked out of the morning. It was a flyer handwritten in neat cursive, announcing a special guest speaker event at the high school. His name was scrawled at the bottom, like it had already been decided. He hadn't spoken about the war in years, hadn't let himself go back to those memories in any way that wasn't private, contained, locked away in the tin box under his bed. And now this stranger, this teacher with her earnest eyes and quiet voice, was asking him to rip open wounds he'd spent years stitching closed. His hands trembled, the paper crumpling slightly under his grip, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the world tilt beneath him. But there was something in Emily's gaze, something that cut through the walls he'd built. It wasn't pity, not exactly, but a kind of understanding, like she knew the weight of what she was asking. "I lost my brother over there," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was in Kandahar. I don't know what you've been through, Mr. Carter, but I know what it means to carry something like that. My students, they're just kids. They play Call of Duty and think war's a game. I want them to know it's real. I want them to see the cost through someone who's lived it." Her words hit James like a punch, raw and unfiltered, dragging up a pain he thought he'd buried deep. Kandahar. The name alone was a trigger, a key, unlocking a flood of images. Sand, heat, the sound of boots on gravel, the weight of a rifle in his hands. He looked away, his eyes fixed on the river, on the way the light danced across the water, trying to anchor himself to the present. But his mind was already slipping, already hearing the distant echo of shouts of chaos. He wanted to tell her no, to hand back the flyer and shut the door on this conversation before it could unravel him further. But something stopped him. A memory, sharp and sudden, of a promise he'd made long ago to never let those he'd lost be forgotten. Emily stood there, waiting, the morning air thick with the scent of pine and the weight of unspoken stories. James's grip on the flyer tightened, his knuckles whitening, and for the first time in years he felt the edges of his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Could he do this? Could he step into a room full of wide-eyed teenagers, their lives untouched by the horrors he carried, and speak truths he'd barely whispered to himself? Or would this be the moment that broke him for good, the noise of the past finally drowning out the silence he'd fought so hard to protect? James Carter stood frozen, the flyer trembling in his grip like a leaf caught in a storm. The weight of Emily Harper's words pressed down on him, heavier than the humid Georgia air, heavier than the memories he'd spent years trying to outrun. Kandahar. The name sliced through the quiet he'd built around himself, sharp and unyielding, dragging him back to a place where the sun burned hotter than hell and the air tasted of dust and fear. His chest tightened, each breath shallow, as if the river nearby had risen up to drown him. He wanted to shove the flyer back into her hands, to turn and walk into his cabin, to lock the door and let the silence swallow him whole again. But her eyes, those hazel eyes that seemed to see right through the walls he'd erected, held him hostage. There was no pity there, only a shared pain, a quiet plea that he couldn't ignore. And beneath it all, that old promise gnawed at him, to never let his brothers be forgotten, no matter how much it cost him. He turned away from her, his boots scuffing against the dirt, his gaze fixed on the Chattahoochee River glinting in the distance. The water moved slow and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside him. "You don't know what you're asking," he muttered, his voice low, rough with years of disuse like gravel under tires. "Ain't as simple as standing up and talking. Some things, they don't come out clean. They don't come out at all." Emily stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the ground between them, but she didn't push. Her voice softened, carrying the weight of her own ghosts. "I'm not asking for clean, Mr. Carter. I'm asking for real. My brother. He wrote me letters from over there. Told me about the heat, the sand in his boots, the way the sky looked different after a firefight. But he never came home to tell the rest. I've got kids in my class who think war's just something you win with a joystick. They need to know it ain't. They need to hear it from someone who's still standing, even if it's hard." Her words hit like shrapnel, jagged and precise, tearing open a scar James thought had long since healed over. He clenched his jaw, the flyer crumpling further in his fist. Still standing. Was he? Most days he felt like a shell, a hollowed-out husk of the man who'd once laughed with his squad, who'd promised to have their backs no matter what. He remembered their faces, too clearly, too painfully. Tommy with his crooked grin, always cracking jokes even when the bullets flew. Marcus with his steady hands, the one who'd patched them up more times than James could count. And Liam, the kid who'd barely turned 20, who'd looked at James like he had all the answers. They weren't here to stand, to speak, to carry their own stories. Why should he get to? Guilt clawed at him, a familiar beast whispering that he didn't deserve this chance, that he'd failed them when it mattered most. Fear followed close behind, cold and relentless, reminding him of the noise, of the roar of explosions in his mind, of the way his hands shook at the mere thought of stepping into a crowded room, of voices and questions and expectations piling up until he couldn't breathe. "I can't," he said finally, the words scraping out of him like they'd been dragged across broken glass. He turned to face her, his hazel eyes dark with something raw, something he couldn't name. "You think I can just walk in there and spill it all out like it's nothing? Like I ain't gonna hear every damn bomb go off again the second I open my mouth? You don't get it. I can't even hear a firecracker without losing it. How am I supposed to stand in front of a bunch of kids and pretend I've got something worth saying?" Emily didn't flinch at his sharpness, though her lips pressed into a thin line. She crossed her arms, her satchel shifting against her hip, and for a moment the morning seemed to hold its breath. "I don't expect you to pretend, Mr. Carter. I expect you to be human. They need to see that. Someone who's been broken by it but still gets up every day. That's more powerful than any textbook I could ever teach from." She hesitated, then added quieter, "And maybe it ain't just for them. Maybe saying it out loud could help you too." Her suggestion hung between them, fragile yet piercing, like a shard of glass catching the light. Help. The word felt foreign, a concept James hadn't let himself entertain in years. He'd built his life around containment, around keeping the past locked in that tin box under his bed, in the silence of his cabin, in the solitude of his garden. To speak it, to let it out, felt like inviting destruction, like tearing down the only structure holding him together. Yet beneath the fear and the guilt, there was a flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a need, small but insistent, to be seen, to be understood, even if it terrified him. He didn't respond, couldn't find the words to bridge the chasm between them. Instead, he turned back to the mulch bag at his feet, bending to haul it over his shoulder, as if the physical weight could ground him, could drown out the storm in his head. "I'll think on it," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper, more to the river than to her. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was all he could muster, a crack in the armor he'd worn so long it felt like part of his skin. Emily nodded, sensing the shift, however small. She reached into her satchel again, pulling out a small card with her name and number scrawled across it. "Take your time," she said, placing it on the edge of his porch railing, where the chipped paint flaked under her touch. "I'm at the school most days. Call if you decide, or if you just want to talk." She lingered for a moment, as if waiting for something more, then turned and walked back to her Subaru, the crunch of gravel under her sandals echoing in the quiet morning. James didn't watch her go. He couldn't. His eyes stayed on the river, on the way the current moved relentlessly forward, uncaring of the battles fought on its banks. The card sat on the railing, a silent challenge, a tiny piece of paper that felt heavier than the rifle he'd once carried. He left it there untouched as he went back to his garden, sinking his hands into the red clay, letting the earth anchor him as his mind spiraled. But the seed had been planted, and no amount of dirt under his nails could bury it. The days that followed were a slow unraveling, each one tighter, more suffocating than the last. James tried to cling to his routine, coffee on the porch at dawn, tending the tomatoes under the blistering sun, driving into Dahlonega for supplies with his cap pulled low, but the flyer and the card haunted him. He'd moved them inside, tucking them under a stack of bills on his kitchen counter, but their presence was a constant hum, a low-frequency noise he couldn't escape. Every time he passed by, he'd feel his pulse quicken, his hands itching to pick them up, to tear them to pieces, or worse, to actually dial the number. He didn't. Not yet. But the question hung over him like storm clouds rolling in over the Blue Ridge Mountains, dark and inevitable. Could he do this? Could he face the noise of his past without crumbling under its weight? On the third night after Emily's visit, the tension snapped like a taut wire. James sat in his recliner, the single lamp casting long shadows across the cabin's worn wooden floors, the tin box open on his lap. The photograph of his squad stared back at him, their faces frozen in a moment before everything went to hell. His thumb traced over Liam's smile, the kid who'd trusted him, who'd believed in him, until the day James couldn't save him. The memory hit hard, unbidden, a flash of searing heat, the deafening blast of an IED, the smell of burning rubber and blood. James's breath hitched, his hands trembling so badly the photo slipped to the floor. He clutched the armrests, trying to anchor himself, but the room spun, the walls closing in as if they carried the echo of that day. "You're home," he gasped, the mantra he'd repeated 1,000 times, but it felt hollow, a lie. He wasn't home. He was there, in the dust and the chaos, shouting for Liam, dragging Marcus through the sand, knowing it was too late for Tommy. The guilt was a lead weight in his chest, paired with a rage he rarely let surface, rage at himself, at the war, at a world that moved on while he remained trapped in that moment. Why me? Why'd I make it out when they didn't? The questions looped, relentless, until he couldn't sit still any longer. He stumbled to his feet, the tin box clattering to the ground, and paced the small room, his boots thudding against the floor, each step louder, heavier, until it felt like the cabin itself was shaking. That's when he saw it. A small, weathered notebook tucked into the corner of the tin box. Something he hadn't touched in years. It was Marcus's, a journal the man had kept during their second tour, filled with scribbled thoughts, sketches of the barren landscape, and letters never sent. James had taken it after everything, a piece of his friend to carry, a debt he could never repay. His hands shook as he picked it up, the leather cover cracked with age, the pages yellowed. He flipped it open, and a folded letter fell out, the handwriting instantly recognizable. It was addressed to him. "James," it began in Marcus's jagged scrawl, "if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Don't know why I'm writing it, feels stupid, sitting here in the dark while the world's on fire. But I gotta say something. You're the best of us, man. You always carried more than you let on, always looked out for us, even when we didn't deserve it. If I don't make it, promise me you'll keep going. Don't let this place win. Tell our story, yeah? Don't let 'em forget. M." James's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, the letter trembling in his hands. Tell our story. The words burned into him, sharper than any memory. A command from beyond the grave he couldn't ignore. Tears stung his eyes, a rare betrayal of the stoicism he'd clung to, and he pressed the letter to his chest as if it could stitch the hole there. Marcus had believed in him, had seen something worth saving even when James couldn't see it himself. The guilt surged again, but this time it was laced with something new, a resolve, fragile but real, to honor that belief, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, James drove into town earlier than usual, the old Ford rumbling down empty streets as the first light kissed the gold dome of the Dahlonega courthouse, a historic landmark that stood as a quiet sentinel over the small Georgia town. The courthouse, with its weathered bricks and towering clock, was a reminder of a past preserved, of stories etched into the very foundation of the place. James had always avoided lingering near it. Too many people, too much noise during the town's frequent festivals, but today something drew him closer. He parked a block away, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and stared at the building, at the way the morning sun glinted off the dome. Stories. That's what it represented. Stories of struggle, of triumph, of loss. Could his be one of them? Could he find a way to speak without shattering? Back at the cabin, the card on the counter seemed to pulse with urgency now, a beacon in the fog of his indecision. He sat at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee growing cold in front of him, and dialed the number before he could talk himself out of it. The line rang once, twice, and then Emily's voice came through, warm but cautious. "Hello? It's James," he said, his voice rough, halting. I read something last night, from a friend I lost over there. He asked me to tell our story. I don't know if I can, but I'm willing to try. For him, for your kids maybe. But I got conditions, no big crowds, no surprises. And if I can't finish, I walk out. That clear?" There was a pause, a soft intake of breath on the other end, and then Emily's voice softened further, thick with something like gratitude. "That's more than clear, Mr. Carter. We'll do it your way. Small group, just my history class. I'll be there with you every step. Can you come by the school tomorrow? We can set it up together." James nodded, though she couldn't see it, his throat tight. "Yeah, tomorrow." He hung up before the weight of his decision could sink in fully, before the fear could claw its way back to the surface. But it was there, lurking, whispering of the noise he'd face, not just the sounds of the school, the chatter of teenagers, the slam of lockers, but the noise in his head, the roar of memories he'd have to voice aloud. He stood, pacing to the porch, staring out at the river once more, the water a mirror to his turmoil. This wasn't just about speaking to a class. This was about breaking open the box he'd locked himself in, about letting the world see the cracks he'd hidden for so long. And as he stood there, the Georgia sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the pine-draped landscape, a flicker of something like hope stirred in him. Dangerous, unfamiliar, but undeniable. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe this wasn't just for the kids. Maybe in telling their story he could begin to rewrite his own. But the cost might be more than he could bear. He'd face that classroom, face the noise, face the past. But at what price? Would it heal him, or would it finally break him beyond repair? Hey, if this story's hitting you as hard as I think it is, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. James's journey ain't over yet, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's see how far he can go together. The decision was made, but it wasn't a resolution. It was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge to confront the very thing he'd fled from for years. Tomorrow at Lumpkin County High, he'd step into a room full of eyes and expectations, armed only with words he wasn't sure he could speak. He thought of Marcus's letter, of Liam's trust, of Tommy's laugh, and felt the weight of their absence like a physical ache. This was for them, he told himself, repeating it like a prayer as the river murmured in the distance. But deep down he knew the truth. This was also for him. A last, desperate grasp at something he couldn't name. Redemption, release, or maybe just the chance to finally breathe without the past choking him. As the day stretched on, James returned to his garden, sinking his hands into the earth, the red clay staining his skin like dried blood. He worked until the sun dipped low, until his back ached and his mind quieted, if only for a moment. But the quiet wouldn't last. Tomorrow loomed like a battlefield, unseen but felt, and for the first time in years James Carter wasn't running from the noise. He was walking straight into it, knowing full well it might be the end of the fragile peace he'd fought to maintain, or the beginning of something he couldn't yet imagine. The morning arrived like a heavy fog rolling over the Chattahoochee River, thick with uncertainty, cloaking everything in a muted grey. James Carter stood on his porch, the air damp against his skin, a chipped mug of black coffee trembling in his hands. He hadn't slept, not really, just a few restless hours haunted by the faces of his squad, their voices echoing through the dark like distant artillery. Today was the day, Lumpkin County High, a room full of kids waiting to hear a story he wasn't sure he could tell. His stomach churned, a mix of dread and something sharper, something that felt like betrayal to the silence he'd guarded for so long. He'd made the call to Emily Harper, committed to this insane idea, but now, standing in the pale dawn light, every instinct screamed at him to run, to drive his old Ford deep into the woods and disappear. Yet Marcus's letter burned in his mind, those jagged words a tether he couldn't cut. Tell our story. He took a shaky breath, set the mug down on the railing and forced himself to move, each step toward the truck feeling like wading through quicksand. The drive to the high school was a blur of pine trees and winding roads, the hum of the engine a low, constant drone that did little to quiet the storm in his head. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white as flashes of memory cut through him. Sand in his boots, the crack of gunfire, Liam's wide, trusting eyes right before it all went wrong. By the time he pulled into the school parking lot, his shirt was damp with sweat, his pulse hammering like he'd just run a mile. The building loomed ahead, all brick and glass, buzzing with the muffled energy of teenagers. Laughter and shouts spilled out from open windows, each sound a tiny explosion in his ears, and he had to clench his jaw to keep from flinching. He parked far from the entrance, needing a moment, needing air, but there was no escaping it. Emily's Subaru was already there, parked near the front, a silent reminder of the promise he'd made. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the folded letter from Marcus, running his thumb over the worn creases, as if it could steady him. It didn't. But it was enough to get him out of the truck, boots hitting the asphalt with a dull thud, each step toward the school a battle of its own. Emily met him at the entrance, her auburn hair catching the morning light, her expression a mix of gratitude and quiet concern. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, professional but warm, and carried a stack of papers that looked like lesson plans. Her voice was gentle, measured, as she guided him through the halls, past rows of lockers and bulletin boards plastered with flyers for football games and bake sales. "I've kept it small, like you asked," she said, glancing at him as they walked. "Just my second period history class, 15 students, no one else. I told them this is a privilege, not a show. They're good kids, Mr. Carter. They'll listen." James nodded, barely hearing her over the roar in his mind, his eyes darting to every corner, every sudden movement, a kid slamming a locker, a teacher calling out a name. Each noise was a landmine, threatening to drag him back to Kandahar, to the heat and the chaos. His hands flexed at his sides, itching to bolt, but he kept walking, kept following her, because stopping now meant letting Marcus down all over again. The classroom was a small fluorescent-lit space, desks arranged in a half-circle facing a chalkboard covered with scribbled dates and names. World War II, Vietnam, Iraq. The students were already there, a mix of curious and restless faces, some slouched in their chairs, others whispering to each other until Emily clapped her hands for attention. James stood near the door, his back to the wall, feeling the weight of their stares like a physical blow. They were so young, untouched by the things he carried, their biggest worries likely centered on grades or prom dates. He felt out of place, a relic from a war they'd only read about, his faded flannel shirt, and beat-up Braves cap, a stark contrast to their bright sneakers and graphic tees. Emily introduced him, her voice steady, calling him a veteran with a story to share, but he barely registered the words. His throat was dry, his chest tight, and for a moment he was sure he'd turn and walk out, conditions or no conditions. Then he caught sight of a kid in the front row, a boy with a buzz cut and a serious expression, scribbling in a notebook like he was already taking notes. Something about that focus, that hunger to understand, snagged at James, pulling him back from the edge just enough to stay. He took a step forward, then another until he stood at the front of the room, hands shoved deep in his pockets to hide the trembling. The room was quiet now, unnervingly so, the kind of quiet that pressed in on him, amplifying every rustle of paper, every shift in a chair. He cleared his throat, the sound raw and uneven, and forced himself to start. "I ain't much for talking," he said, his voice low, rough with disuse, his southern drawl thick under the strain. "But I got a story about some folks who mattered to me, folks I lost, and I reckon you ought to know what that costs." The words felt like tearing open a wound, each one jagged and bloody, but he pushed on, his eyes fixed on a spot above their heads, unable to meet their gazes. He told them about Afghanistan, about the unrelenting sun and the weight of a rifle, about nights when the fear was so thick you could taste it. He told them about Tommy's jokes, Marcus's steady hands, Liam's quiet faith in him. And then, haltingly, he told them about the day it all shattered, an IED on a dusty road, the blast so loud it still rang in his ears, the moment he realized he couldn't save them all. His voice broke on that last part, cracking like brittle wood, and he stopped, his breath hitching as the memory surged, vivid and suffocating. The room spun, the fluorescent lights too bright, the air too thin. He could hear it, the explosion, the shouts, the chaos, and his hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms as he fought to stay present. A chair scraped against the floor, sharp and sudden, and he flinched hard, his whole body jerking as if expecting incoming fire. The students froze, wide-eyed, some of them leaning forward, others looking away as if unsure what to do with his rawness. Shame burned through him, hot and bitter, the urge to flee stronger than ever. He was unraveling, right here in front of them, the noise of the past drowning out everything else. He took a step back toward the door, his boots scuffing the linoleum, ready to abandon this mistake before it broke him completely. But then Emily was there, stepping into his line of sight, her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't touch him, didn't crowd him, just stood a few feet away, her hazel eyes steady, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Carter, you don't have to keep going if you can't. But what you've said already, it's enough, it's more than enough. They see it now, they feel it." Her words cut through the haze, not as a demand, but as a lifeline, pulling him back just enough to catch his breath. And then, from the front row, the boy with the buzz cut spoke up, his voice hesitant but clear. "Sir, I'm sorry you lost your friends. My uncle, he was in Iraq. He don't talk about it neither. But I wish he would, 'cause I want to know. I want to understand why he's so quiet all the time." The boy's words were simple, unpolished, but they hit James like a punch, raw and real, echoing Emily's plea from days before. Understanding. Not pity, not judgment, just a need to connect, to bridge the gap between their worlds. James paused, his chest still heaving, his eyes dropping to the floor as he wrestled with the weight of that moment. The room was silent again, but it wasn't oppressive now. It was waiting, holding space for whatever he chose next. And in that silence, something shifted, a crack of light in the darkness he'd carried so long. He thought of Marcus's letter, of the promise to keep going, to not let the war win. He thought of Liam and Tommy, of the laughter before the loss, of the stories they'd never get to tell themselves. Slowly, painfully he straightened, his shoulders squaring as if bracing for one last fight. "I ain't gonna lie to y'all," he said, his voice steadier now, though still rough with emotion. "It don't get easier. Some days, a loud noise, a car backfiring, a door slamming, it takes me right back there. Makes me feel like I'm still in the fight even though I've been home for years. But I'm standing here 'cause I owe it to 'em, to my brothers. They didn't make it, but their story can." So you remember this. War ain't a game. It's a debt. And some of us, we pay it for the rest of our lives. The words hung in the air, heavy and true, and for the first time James looked at the students directly, meeting their eyes one by one. Some had tears on their cheeks, others sat rigid, processing a reality they'd never touched before. The boy with the buzz cut nodded, his pen still, his notebook forgotten. Emily stood off to the side, her hands clasped in front of her, a faint sheen in her eyes as she gave him a small, grateful nod. And James felt it then. A release, sharp and unexpected, like a knot in his chest, unwinding just enough to let him breathe. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was something. A step. A crack in the walls he'd built, letting in a sliver of light he hadn't thought possible. In the days that followed, James wasn't the same man who'd walked into that classroom. The change was slow, subtle at first, but it was there, etched into the small shifts in his routine, in the way he carried himself. He still woke before dawn, still drank his coffee on the porch overlooking the river, but now sometimes he'd linger there a little longer, letting the morning sounds, the chirp of birds, the rustle of leaves, wash over him without bracing for a threat. He still tended his garden, sinking his hands into the red Georgia clay, but he started leaving the radio on low, an old country station crackling through the static, a quiet challenge to the silence he'd once craved. And when he drove into Dahlonega for supplies, he didn't always rush out before the town woke. Once he even stopped at the diner, sat at the counter with a slice of pecan pie, and let Miss Clara chat at him about the weather, nodding along though he barely spoke. It wasn't easy. Every loud laugh, every clatter of a dish made him tense, but he stayed, forcing himself to face the noise, to live in it, even if just for a few minutes. There was a cost to this change, a sacrifice he made without fully realizing it until it was done. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the pines, casting golden streaks across his cabin, James pulled the tin box from under his bed. He sat on the floor, the photograph of his squad in one hand, Marcus's letter in the other, and felt the weight of them like never before. They'd been his shield, his tether to the past, a private grief he'd guarded with everything he had. But now, after speaking their names aloud, after letting their story breathe in that classroom, he knew he couldn't keep carrying them this way. Not locked away, not hidden. So with hands that trembled more from emotion than fear, he took the photograph and the letter and placed them in a simple wooden frame he'd bought in town. He hung it on the wall above his recliner, right where the lamplight would catch it each night. It was a renunciation of the silence, a surrender of the secret pain he'd hoarded, an offering to the world that he was done hiding from their memory, even if it meant facing it every day. That act, small as it was, felt like laying down a weapon he'd carried too long. It hurt, like all true change does, a quiet ache that pulsed with every glance at those faces. But it also freed something in him, a space where grief could live alongside something else. Memory, yes, but also purpose. He started writing too, late at night when the cabin was quiet, scribbling in a notebook he kept on the kitchen counter. Not much at first, just fragments, moments from the war, things he remembered about Tommy's humor, Marcus's courage, Liam's quiet strength. But it grew, page by page, a record of what he'd lost and what he'd survived, a way to keep telling their story even when his voice failed him. He didn't know if he'd ever show it to anyone, not even Emily, but the act of writing was enough, a bridge between the man he'd been and the man he might become. Weeks later, on a cool autumn morning when the air carried the first bite of winter, James drove out to a small cemetery just outside Dahlonega, a place he hadn't visited in years. It was tucked away off a dirt road, surrounded by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, the headstones weathered by time and southern rain. He parked near the gate, pulling a small worn dog tag from his pocket. One of his own kept from his time in Afghanistan, a piece of himself he'd buried metaphorically, but never physically. His boots crunched on fallen leaves as he walked through the rows, stopping at a modest stone marker near the back. The name etched deep, Tommy Reed. It wasn't Tommy's real grave. His body was buried states away, closer to his family, but it was a memorial, a place where the town had honored its fallen, including those James had served with. He knelt, the damp earth soaking through his jeans, and pressed the dog tag into the soil at the base of the stone. his fingers lingering on the cold metal as if reluctant to let go. For a long moment he stayed there, head bowed, the weight of years pressing down on him. The wind whispered through the oaks, carrying the scent of rain and decay, and he felt it. The ache of loss, yes, but also the slow, steady pulse of something like peace. He spoke, voice low and rough, as if Tommy could hear him. "I told him about you, man. Told him how you kept us laughing even when we were scared out of our minds. I ain't forgot. I won't." The words were a vow, a final tether to bind him to the past without letting it strangle him. When he stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, the dog tag gleamed dully in the fading light, a silent sentinel at the foot of the stone, a piece of James left behind to guard the memory while he learned to move forward. As he walked back to his truck, the sky ablaze with the deep oranges and purples of sunset, James felt the world shift beneath him, just slightly, like the river finding a new course after a storm. Time, he realized, was a merciless thing, relentless in its march, uncaring of the wounds it left behind. War carved out pieces of a man, left hollows where laughter and trust once lived. But time, if you let it, could fill those spaces with something else. Not healing, not fully, but a kind of quiet strength, a way to carry the weight without breaking under it. Silence had been his refuge, his cage for so long. But now he understood that rebeginning wasn't about forgetting the noise of the past. It was about learning to live with it, to let it be part of the song instead of the only note. And as the first stars pricked through the darkening sky, James knew he was still a long way from whole, but for the first time in years, he believed he might get there, one unsteady step at a time. If this story has stirred something in you, if it's made you feel the weight and the hope of James's journey, I'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button and stick around for more. Drop a comment below, just a simple, "I believe in second chances," or share a piece of your own story if you feel it. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone wrestling with their own noise, pass it on. Let's keep telling these stories together.